Well, good morning, everyone. I want to thank Senator Lamar Alexander, my partner in this effort and co-chair, co-sponsor of this piece of legislation. I'll introduce him in a moment. I also want to thank Ernie Allen, the co-founder and president of the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, who really stepped up and helped us so much after Katrina and Rita and some of the other storms that we've experienced in the last few years. And Dr. Cathy Grace, who is the director of the Early Childhood Development Policy at the Children's Defense Fund, who's been a key player in this effort. And I also want to thank others that are in attendance, Liz Blake with the Children's Coalition, Habitat for Humanity, Chris Revere, National Commission on Children and Disasters, the Children's Health Fund, American Red Cross, Habitat for Humanity, Save the Children, and there are any number of other organizations that have been very helpful in the crafting of this legislation, and particularly the National Commission that was chaired by Mark Shriver, who is not with us today, but is represented by these fine folks here. And I also want to make just a thank you to Representative Corin Brown, who sponsored the initial legislation that created the commission, and a good bit of this work was done through that commission. So I want to thank her. She's not in attendance this morning, and Senator Chris Dodd, who introduced the commission bill in the Senate as well, and acknowledge both of them for their leadership. I'm here today to announce the introduction of this bill, the Child Safety Care and Education Continuity Act of 2010, which I'll be introducing with Lamar Alexander. This bill grew out of the gaps that were obvious in care of children and families in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and Rita. There were almost 370,000 children displaced along the Gulf Coast after those storms, displaced from their homes, displaced from their schools, displaced from their universities, displaced from their child care centers. It was extraordinarily disruptive, to say the least, and devastating. There were studies that were done in the aftermath of these storms. One of them that I'd like to cite is the LSU Department of Psychiatry screened 12,000 children during the school year of 2005 and 6. 18% of them had had a family member that was killed in these disasters. So not only and 49% of them met the threshold for mental health referral. So not only was there physical displacement, obviously, but there was also tremendous mental trauma. This bill attempts to try to fill some of those gaps, to try to give more continuity and care to children as the disaster sweeps through, to usher in a stronger recovery. And if we think about it, parents who we depend on, adults between the ages primarily of 25, I guess, and 65, many of whom are still active parents or grandparents, we depend on them after a disaster has occurred to help rebuild the community. It's very difficult for them actually to get back to work if their children aren't in school or aren't in daycare. It's actually impossible. So while the focus of this is really on children in disasters, it's actually a building block to a stronger, more resilient, common sense kind of recovery, approach to recovery. So that is the legislation in general. It has a few points. It allows for provisions for funding for schools as children find new homes and new schools. It will provide for expanded opportunities for higher education. It provides mental health counseling for pre-K through Head Start agencies. It requires HHH and the states to work together for disaster guidance for Medicaid and LACHIP. And it increases access to child care services for disasters. So in the shelters where families flee, there are now going to be hopefully provisions for children to be cared for and for the shelter system to appropriately reflect the intake of families, both adults and children who use these shelters. So many of the gaps have been closed, hopefully, by this bill. We have broad support, and I'd like now to call on my friend Lamar Alexander, who was really in the lead, scrambling after Katrina and Rita, to try to find a way for us to find thousands of spaces in schools all across America, and the way to fund those spaces for children that needed the safety and security of a classroom, something familiar to them. They might have been in Tennessee, but the second grade classroom in Tennessee looked a lot like the second grade classroom they left in the lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans East, and it gave those children a sense of comfort and calm, and as importantly, it gave their parents an opportunity to catch a breath and start planning for how they would rebuild the neighborhoods that were destroyed. So I want to turn this over now to my wonderful colleague, Lamar Alexander.
Thank you, Mary. After Hurricane Katrina, there were 47,000 students who ended up in Texas the next year going to school. There were 4,100 who were in Tennessee. The schools of Memphis particularly had lots of extra students. There were 3,000 students in Arkansas, and there were a lot of students who moved around Louisiana from, I remember especially going from New Orleans up to Baton Rouge. And so the question was, what do we do about that? How do we help the communities who are damaged restart? And how do we help the children who are displaced go to school? How do we help their families? Well, as Mary said, we scrambled, and I think the Congress reacted in record time for the Congress, but it really wasn't fast enough for the children and the school districts, because we had a lot of issues to deal with. What do you do about children who end up in parochial schools or private schools or public schools or in another state or in another part of the state? So this is an example, thanks to Senator Landrieu's leadership and the work of the commissions who are represented here today, which she'll say more about. This is an example of Congress doing something we don't always do. We're learning from history. We're getting ahead of the curve. And so the next time we have a disaster, whether it's in North Carolina or whether it's in New Orleans or whether it's in Texas or wherever it might be, we won't have to scramble so much, because we'll already have in place what we learned from history. How do we help the communities restart, and how do we help the displaced children who may find themselves suddenly in another state, in another county, in another school? So this is a textbook case, I think, of an example of the Congress reacting wisely to recommendations from good advocates, learning from history, and I'm delighted to join with Senator Landrieu in co-sponsoring it. I want to especially give my thanks to Senator Dodd and the late Senator Kennedy, because they scrambled, we all scrambled together in dealing with some touchy problems right after Katrina, and this builds on the framework that Senator Kennedy and Senator Dodd and Senator Landrieu and others of us worked on after those events.
Thank you, Ernie.
Thank you, Senator Landrieu, Senator Alexander, for your extraordinary leadership on a timely and important issue. I am honored to be here today representing the National Commission on Children and Disasters. Our dynamic, distinguished chairman, Mark Shriver, cannot be here, so I am pleased to represent him. I particularly want to express my thanks to Senator Landrieu. We had the opportunity to work together in reuniting thousands of children who had been dislocated from their families as a result of Hurricane Katrina. And I think that experience showed us that there are holes and gaps in the way America responds to these kinds of disasters. Your legislation fills those gaps, and we believe is an historic step forward on behalf of children everywhere. Why is it so important? Well, the number of annual presidential disasters has more than doubled from an average of 24 a year in the 1980s to 56 per year this decade. Fully a quarter of our population are children, 18 years and younger, 74 million citizens. Each week, 12 million children under the age of 5 attend daycare, but according to Save the Children, only 7 states have basic disaster preparedness standards. Children are not simply small adults. They have unique needs, and disasters are especially disruptive to children in terms of their health, their mental health, their education, their socialization needs. A sense of routine must be reestablished quickly in order for children to recover. Senator Landrieu, Senator Alexander, your legislation addresses those gaps and shortfalls which were have been identified by the National Commission on Children in Disasters in areas of mental health counseling, access to child care, emergency planning for child care providers, and issues surrounding children's unique medical and mental health needs. The Commission supports this bill because it will remedy the benign neglect of children's needs following a disaster. And we hope and we urge that Congress and the President act swiftly on its passage and make it law. All Americans, especially our children, deserve no less than a disaster recovery system that is rapid, comprehensive, and responsive. Thank you very much.
Senator Landrieu, Senator Alexander, members of the press and advocates, I would like to express my appreciation to the National Commission on Children in Disasters for their work in the continuing journey of recovery for thousands of Gulf Coast residents, and of course to the Senators Landrieu and Alexander for their leadership in this most important area. Imagine you had to leave your home with only basic belongings, maybe a few family pictures. You return a week later and there's nothing left, no house, no church, no school, no business, only clothes hanging in trees and piles of trash as far as the eye can see. It's too quiet and it stinks. The past and future merged, and all that's left is some rubble and a few broken pieces of china or a shoe. I've never been in a war zone, but I think I came close when I got to the Gulf Coast about a week after Katrina made landfall. My job is little children, and I was called into work to reestablish the early care and education system through my job at that time at Mississippi State University as director of the Early Childhood Institute. Leadership at the Chevron refinery in Pascagoula realized the importance of reestablishing the early care and education programs as soon as possible so that when schools reopened, the younger children could come back to their learning environments as well as their older siblings. And Chevron knew that the recovery of the basic economic base in communities was dependent on child care for the workforce. Their corporate leadership was invaluable and their monetary contributions crucial. With support from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, Save the Children, numerous faith-based groups led by the United Methodist, and the Help and Hope Community Foundation, the first months after the storm were a testimony to the families who were affected as well as the ingenuity of the American people. The state of Mississippi agreed to allow funds to go to families that were affected by the storm to fund child care for 60 days after the storm, and in some cases extended that time. The Department of Human Services was told by FEMA the state would be reimbursed. To my knowledge, the state is still waiting. The Mississippi State Extension Service was a great support in providing basic water and ice to families in isolated areas as well as in the recovery efforts of family child care homes. I live 5 hours from the Mississippi Gulf Coast in northeast Mississippi, so my home and business and family safety was not at risk. The teams of Mississippians who helped in the child care recovery process, as well as those Louisiana residents in the northern part of the state that were visible in the parishes along the Gulf Coast in Louisiana, worked as a team. For months, the coastal residents were too traumatized. As several of my friends commented, you'll just have to think for me. I trust you, and I just can't think. A month following the storm, I was meeting in one of the few operable early care and education centers with the teaching staff, and I knew that we were coming back. I heard children laughing, and I saw teachers smile. After a few more weeks, I saw the children playing FEMA Man and doing weather broadcasts, so I knew the children were working through their demons. The teachers and parents were another story. Mental health services were few and for children almost non-existent. We did the best we could implementing play-based therapy, training, and offered no-cost teacher respite group trainings. As hard as it was to rebuild the outside of centers and communities, supporting individuals in their personal recovery is much harder. We're still involved in programs attempting to address social emotional recovery of the children who were babies or not even born when Katrina hit. Senators Landrieu and Alexander, this bill will ensure our country remembers children in the future if anything ever happens that requires massive emergency recovery measures be taken. Time was our enemy in the days following Katrina. Hopefully, the passage of this bill will ensure a quick response so a national disaster is not compounded by man-made failure to use the country's resources to help its children. The most telling conversation I had during year 2 of the recovery process was with the director of that time, MEMA, which is the Mississippi FEMA. When I quizzed him on why FEMA was not active in service provision to young children and their families, he said, "Ma'am, little children just weren't on our radar." Senator Landrieu and Senator Alexander, you have made sure that no one will ever be able to say that again. Thank you from the families living on the Gulf Coast. Thank you from America's children.
Thank you, Dr. Grace. The Gulf Coast is very fortunate to have you in the state of Mississippi particularly. Any questions or comments? Any of the press?
I was just
Yes,
wondering, I know there are a lot of response measures in here, and I'm wondering if there's going to be, if there's anything in the bill or if there's anything in future legislation that will look at children from an evacuation standpoint in terms of unique needs.
The piece that's in this bill that I believe, and the staff's here that can respond, is number one, there's going to be a requirement for daycare centers to have some evacuation planning in place in order to receive funding or support. There's also going to be some imprint in the shelters for child care, which, as the doctor said, children weren't on the radar screen, which is hard to believe. Now they will be. And all through the FEMA processes, there'll have to be accommodations made. Is that generally the understanding, Ben? So yes, there will be provisions. Yeah, Jerry? Well, it's an authorization bill. It's an authorization bill. I don't know if there are estimates in here, but a lot of this money will come from, emergency funding that's, of course, off budget and is in the general billions of dollars that are set aside for emergencies. It'll just be authorized, these programs, to tap into it. I mean, the sad thing is right now, there may be billions of dollars available after a disaster and no authorization mechanism to get children the help they need even when money is available. That's what this bill will outline, a pathway so that children and families can tap into the funds that are available and be used, as the doctor said, and I couldn't have said it better myself, and I've led the fight to rebuild schools and hospitals. That's been tough. We still need hundreds, dozens, if not hundreds of facilities built along the Gulf Coast, but the harder thing is how to build from the inside of people, and we just did not have enough support for mental health counseling and support for adults or children, and this will start, hopefully, that process in some way. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mary.
Wonderful. It's going
Appreciate
to be
being
good.
part of it.